plastic crisis and how sustainable finance can drive change. So I will briefly introduce the main topics and then I will give the floor to our speakers. First of all, plastics is unfortunately widespread across land, sea, and air. The current plastics life cycle is far from circular. Globally, the annual production of plastics has doubled between 2000 and 2019, while plastic waste has more than doubled. Mismanaged plastic waste is the main source of macroplastic leakage, while microplastics come from a range of sources such as tire abrasion, brake wear, or textile washing. Moreover, plastics have a significant impact on carbon footprint. 90% of their greenhouse gas emissions come from their production and conversion from fossil fuels. Finally, plastics have also impacts on human health. Some experts believe we are in the midst of a plastic health crisis, since plastic-associated chemicals are consistently detected in human biosamples during pregnancy, at birth, in children and in adults, throughout the body and also in our brains. So, during this webinar, we will go deeper into these topics, and we will also try to understand how sustainable investors, how sustainable finance can contribute to reduce this problem, to a solution to this problem, therefore to drive change. So I will now give the floor to our keynote speaker, Lionel Heurtin, ESG analyst at Ofi Invest Asset Management. Please, Lionel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Arianna. So my name is Lionel Heurtin. I'm a SRI analyst at Ofi Invest Asset Management. I will make a 15-minute presentation on the plastic crisis and how sustainable finance can drive change. Plastic pollution of the ocean is one of the most pressing environmental challenges, with an estimated 8 million metric tons of plastic entering the ocean every year. This has devastating consequences for marine life. Investors have to report on how they tackle biodiversity challenges based on EU regulation and on their overall portfolio biodiversity footprint. It is urgent to act for biodiversity. The situation is deteriorating rapidly. As of today, 46,000 species are threatened with extinction. WWF computed that population of vertebrated species declined by 73% since 1970. According to the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, there are 5 pressures that impact biodiversity. Plastic pollution is part of the pollution pressure, of course, but plastic pollution is also has indirect impacts on all other pressures. For instance, plastic contamination of landfills and seas fall into the land and sea changes. Plastic is produced from oil which is depleting past biodiversity resources, so it falls into direct exploitation of resources. Plastic is also responsible for more than 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions, so it falls into the climate change pressure. And also you've got bacteria traveling on top of the plastic waste and the ocean, and so it can become invasive species. The plastic has been the most bulk product by man on Earth, with 8.3 billion tons produced since the 1950s. And when you look at the numbers, they are staggering. The production has been doubling in the last 20 years. The consumption has quadrupled in the last 30 years. In the next 40 years, we will have a tripling of plastic production in the business as usual scenario. If you look at what is the issue of plastic, unfortunately for 2/3, is just for a very short lifespan products such as packaging, consumer goods, clothing, and textile. Where do the plastic ends? 50% ends in landfills, 19% is incinerated, 22% is released into the environment, and only 9% is recycled. So some great efforts needs to reverse the current situation. And plastic is everywhere around us. If you look at this chart, the products that are the most used in plastic are food packaging, plastic bags, plastic bottles, pipes for water system, boots, floor covering. It's a never-ending list. Those products represent macroplastic. They are made of particles with a size above 5 millimeters. 1/3 of the plastic production is dedicated to packaging, but packaging represents 88% of what is released into the environment for macroplastic. I spoke to you about macroplastic, which is mainly packaging, but with time it degrades to microplastic, which is the plastic particles with a size below 5 millimeters. The two other most important microplastic are tire road wear particles and also synthetic textile particles. They represent 2/3 of the total of microplastic. Car and truck tires can lose up to 25% of their weight in tire road wear particles. It is the abrasion effect on the road. Half of the plastic rubber used is natural, and the other half is of synthetic origin. Regarding synthetic textile, when you wash your clothes with your washing machine or by hands, it releases particles unless you have a filter in place. And if you look at this chart, it is showing where microplastic pollution is coming from. So from the water runoff from roads or sewages, that is the dirty water from household and other activities, and where they do end. And what you can see is that about 50% of all the microplastic pollutions stay into the ground, the soil, but 48% go into the ocean. Overall, plastic, macroplastic and microplastic mislead animals believing it is food, and every year 100,000 mammals are trapped or suffocated because of plastic, and also 1 million seabirds do die because of plastics, and about 700 marine species are affected, and 17% of them are threatened as of today. In the next slide, I introduced a word of caution about the estimated number of millions of tons of plastics that reach the ocean. Last year, I went to a conference organized by the FRB, the French contact for IBES, and the theme of the day was on the future of the ocean. An academic named Johnny Gaspieri explained that scientists have revised down the number of tons of plastics that goes into the ocean. But overall, Mr. Gaspieri's conclusion was that if the rate of the leak is lower than previously estimated, and the problem in the ocean is so huge, we cannot think about a small 10-20% reduction in plastic production, but we need to think about a much bigger decrease in plastic production to stop the ocean pollution. Now, I will share with you what are the levers for action and the risks to consider as a sustainable investor. First, investors need to understand what are the impacts generated by all the products and services offered by companies, including in their value chain. Second, they need to engage companies on the topic and raise the awareness about the plastic impact and need to understand how they can mitigate their risk. Investors need to ask companies to be more transparent. Do they look into some alternatives to plastic? And do they understand the need to set plastic reduction trajectories? Those are stewardship activities. Third, with SFDR, investors started to measuring their portfolio biodiversity footprint a few years ago, and soon they will compute a plastic footprint. Fourth, investors will have to finance solutions, R&D and CapEx ramp up, for grooming and developing alternatives to plastics. The risk to consider when investing in a company are how issuers are managing the negative impact linked to any ecosystem pollution, how they manage the risk linked to the controversies that are associated with biodiversity and plastic pollution because this risk can be reputational. For instance, if you have an NGO campaigning against them, but they can also be legal risk, and we have seen a beginning of action on behalf of the duty of care. There can be health-related risk as well. Another risk is how a company is able to adapt itself to regulatory changes tackling plastic pollution. In Europe, you have the EU circular economy and EU single-use plastic directives. Companies have to adapt at an extra cost for them. And lastly, investors need to consider how issuers can adopt target on plastic reduction and how themselves, as investors, they can work on a portfolio with a deplastification trajectory. This slide is about global regulation tackling plastic. A good proxy to assess it is the current legislative efforts regarding lightweight plastic bag laws. There is a Wikipedia section tracking it. 112 countries have implemented bans, including China and India. 19 countries have implemented only regional bans, including the USA and Brazil. 36 countries have charge of voluntary charge models. So overall, a total of 167 countries have moved so far on that topic out of 195. You can see that countries such as Russia, Vietnam, Algeria have not moved yet, and also I can say Saudi Arabia. Ofi Invest AM has led the plastic engagement campaign from 2020 to 2022 for its shareholder massif with the help of the NGO Surfrider Europe. We contacted 19 companies within our portfolio and sent them a personalized questionnaire in 3 parts to understand their approach on this topic. We contacted companies exposed to packaging and also microplastics. So we had consumer goods companies, food and beverage manufacturers, and also apparel retailer companies. We had one tire manufacturer, and also we had fast food and catering companies. The 3 parts of the questionnaire were the company commitment on plastic reduction policies, the objectives and actions they were implementing, and the results. The outcome of the engagement was that plastic pollution was being seen as a risk by all those companies, but it was not identified in their due diligence plan. Just one company, Unilever, integrated a variable remuneration criteria linked to plastic. Unilever had 25% of long-term remuneration linked to 8 sustainability metrics, and one was the increase of recycled materials in packaging. Despite these 2/3 of companies committed to reduce the amount of plastic in their packaging, the majority did not display the necessary measure to achieve those goals. Many companies prefer the circularity path to reduction. Regarding microplastics, some companies did not know about this issue at all and asked for extra information from us. We didn't have a lot of transparency and numbers from the apparel companies overall. Regarding the good practices, and what we have found is that all the companies were members of associations such as WWF or the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And this is good because they do share best practices between them. Many companies help the funding of local NGOs in collecting plastic waste, as there is a huge gap between emerging market and developed market in infrastructure in terms of collecting the waste. Under improvement aspect, we saw limited efforts to reduce microplastic pollution impacts. Also, we have not seen a lot of commitments of companies to reduce in absolute terms their plastic consumption, and this is something we would like to see more. On the gaps, it's very rare that companies ask for requirements on plastic reduction to their suppliers, and if they do so, they do not include a requirement on microplastic. Many companies practice the double standard. It is when you have a different policy on plastic between developed and emerging markets, and not just one worldwide policy. Also, we found that it was a distant prospect for some companies to go away from plastic. One consumer good company said the plastic packaging was part of their brand equity. Lastly, a significant number of companies we talked to were still in the process of computing the plastic consumption. I must highlight we did the 2-year engagement during the COVID-19 period on companies had some positive and negative effect on their plastic volume consumption due to COVID-19. Unfortunately, for nature, the trend of plastic consumption is still up for those 19 companies. Ofi Invest AM has decided to carry on its engagement on plastic with signing an investor statement on plastic coordinated by VBDO, the Dutch Association of Investors for Sustainable Development, which was released in May 2023, and we are lead investor engaging Carrefour with VBDO. Unfortunately, recently, we witnessed some recent setbacks on plastic pollution. 2 companies we engaged in 2022 revised down their commitment on plastic, Unilever and Coca-Cola. President Trump wants plastic straws back into the USA. The negotiation in Busan released a non-paper, but we need to be optimistic. The 5th session was extended into 5.2. It will take place beginning of August in Geneva, in Palais des Nations, and I have heard that the text is in better shape than when it enters the Busan negotiation. Investors need support to develop their skill and expertise on the topic. This is why I listed some resources for you could use to increase your knowledge on the topic. The Minderoo Foundation, based in Australia, is doing a fantastic job on pointing to the biggest virgin polymer producer. It has also developed a circularity score to highlight the player doing the greatest efforts. Regarding fast-moving companies, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation work is very similar to the Science-Based Target Initiative for Climate. An increased role of this institution will help harmonizing evaluation framework and setting target among companies. On microplastic, and specifically, we barely find numbers from apparel companies during our engagement, but since then, I found out that the Changing Markets Foundation has released several studies that can give you a lot of insight into synthetic fibers consumption of those companies. We are still lacking information regarding the tire industry, such actors such as Pirelli. The Euro 7 regulation allowed us to have the metric tons of microplastic in the EU generated by tire abrasion. It's 450,000 metric tons. And the Euro 7 regulation sets a 30% reduction target by 2030. It would be very helpful if an NGO would address the plastic pollution generated by this sector. That was my last slide, and now Arianna will follow on with moderating the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Lionel. Very interesting, a lot of data. I think that everyone can see it's his contribution to plastic pollution in our daily life, unfortunately. So there is also something for our daily life, as said. And so now we can open the roundtable with Raphaëlle Genoud, Corporate Partnerships Manager, Surfrider Foundation Europe. Hello, Raphaëlle.
Hi, Arianna.
Welcome. And Freek van Tiel, Project Manager, Sustainability and Responsible Investment at the Dutch Association of Investors for Sustainable Development, VBDO. Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome. So let's start with Raphaëlle. I would ask you to go deeper in the impacts of plastic pollution, both on the oceans and also on human health, and also to explain us why are plastics reduction targets so important.
Yeah, thank you very much, Arianna, and hello, everybody. Before answering this question, let me introduce myself quickly. So my name is Raphaëlle, and I work as a corporate partnerships manager at Surfrider Foundation Europe, which is an NGO dedicated to the protection of the ocean. And at Surfrider, we focus on 3 key areas. The first one is the water quality and the human health. Second one is the coastal development and climate change. And the third one is the fight against marine litter, with a strong focus on single-use plastic, because our mission is to stop plastic pollution at the source. So in my role, I don't just work on fundraising towards company, I also try to influence them to adopt best practices to protect our ocean. So to answer this question, what are the impacts of plastic pollution and why reduction targets are so important? First, let me give you a few figures. So you all know that plastic is made of fossil fuel. It is cheap, it is lightweight, and extremely durable. But we realize that the same quality of this plastic make it an environmental nightmare and disaster. So how much plastic do we produce each year? We produce over 400 million tons of plastic in the world, which is kind of a crazy figure. Since the 50s, over 9 billion tons of plastic have been produced. And out of this, 75% has already been thrown away in the landfills, in the environment, or in the ocean. That is why reduction targets are so important, because if we do not reduce plastic production, it is projected to increase by 40% by 2050. So why is plastic such a big problem? There are three main reasons for this. Because plastic is designed to be thrown away. Most plastic is single use. It is used just for a few minutes and then stay in the environment forever. For example, a plastic bag for an average is used of just 25 minutes before being thrown away. And the second reason is that plastic never disappears. So you all know those infographics with the duration of plastic items in the environment. Well, this is not totally accurate. Plastic is not biodegradable. It just breaks down into smaller pieces. So any claim that the plastic is biodegradable or compostable is false. This means every piece of plastic that we produce still exists in another form today in the environment. The third reason why plastic is such a big problem is that plastic pollution is increasing. Plastic production is not slowing down. We're making more plastic than ever before, and yet we have no real solution for dealing with this waste. So moving on the plastic pollution in the ocean, and starting with the origin of plastic that we find in the ocean and on the beaches, and where does this plastic go? So we estimate at Surfrider that 80% of the marine litters come from inland, and with the action of the rivers and the wind makes its way to the ocean and on the beaches. Around 80% of this marine litter that we collect is made of plastic, mainly packaging waste like bottles, food wrappers, and so on. And according to the United Nations, 10 million tons of plastic enter the ocean every year. And once this plastic reaches the ocean, it never leaves. What you only see is the 15% on the beaches and on the coastline, the 15% that are at the surface of the water. But what you have to know is that 70% of the plastic sinks to the ocean floor. So you only see 30% of the plastic on ocean beaches and at the surface. So to conclude this part, what are the impacts of plastic? You have many impacts on the ocean, but I will focus on three. The first one are the impacts on marine life, and Lionel talked about it before, but 90% of the seabirds have plastic in their stomach, and by 2050, we estimate that this could reach 99% of the seabirds. 100,000 marine mammals die each year due to marine litter. Actually, animals mistake plastic for food, causing starvation, choking, and also poisoning. And because sometimes plastic prevents them from searching for food. Plastic also transports a long distance invasive species that could be harmful and damaging for the entire ecosystem. And as we said before, and I will conclude on this, plastic has huge impacts on human health. Plastic contains toxic chemicals like PFAS, for instance, or other phthalates that are linked to serious health risks such as hormonal disruption, cancer, reproductive issues. Also, the cigarette butts have plastic in it, and just one cigarette butt can pollute up to 500 liters of water if it's entered the ocean. And to conclude, we talk about the microplastic are even now found in our water, in our food, and even in our blood. So this is not a really positive and cheerful context, but the good part in it is that we have solution to tackle it, and Surfrider is working to tackle this plastic pollution at the source.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, of course, it's not a positive situation, but let's talk now about some solutions. So thank you very much, Raphaëlle, and I will come back to you after giving the floor to Freek. So hello, Freek, welcome again. Can you please help us to understand what solutions can we have towards against plastics pollutions? In particular, what are the main results of the late plastic negotiations in Busan, as well as the latest developments since then? And also, if you can illustrate the work VBDO carries out to facilitate investors' engagement with companies on plastic pollution, and what recommendations do you have in order to make this engagement effective? Thank you.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, I think it is now, or maybe good morning. My name is Freek van Til, and I work at VBDO, which is the Dutch Association of Investors for Sustainable Development. It's a Dutch SIF, as it is. So pretty much similar to the SIF network that you'll find around the globe. Thank you for asking and inviting me to speak here on two topics, basically. As part of the work that we've done on plastics in the past few years with VBDO, we've raised awareness for the topic in the investor community. We've built collective investor engagement initiatives and engaged companies in that regard. But we've also done a lot of public policy advocacy and investor advocacy. And I want to highlight just a few of the works that we've done, the asks that we've had, the expectations that we set out together with investors, but also highlighting how it was in Busan. Because I went to Busan at the end of last year, imagining, right, this is the final round of negotiations. We've worked so many years on this. Let's have a good look at how this is being concluded before we can move on to other pressing topics. I want to go back a few years in time. 3 years ago at VBDO, we started to work on this topic. We started with a research called Plastic Perspectives. It's a research where we deep dived basically in 18 fast-moving consumer good companies and grocery retailers in the EU, but also in the UK. And we assessed their strategies, their commitments, the reporting, but also their lobby activities, addressing the plastic crisis and looking for clear systemic plastic reduction solutions. So what are they doing in terms of absolute reduction and reduction in general? This sort of formed the basis of our work in the years after, where in 2023, Lionel already mentioned it, we launched an investor statement together with almost 200 institutional investors, calling on companies to reduce their plastic packaging. So note that this is on packaging primarily, but also to phase out hazardous chemicals, bring up toxicity, make it transparent, and bring that up in the conversations also relating to human health. And as a final element, to align the corporate lobby activities with ambitious regulation. And of course, the legally binding instrument that is the Global Plastics Treaty. We often noted that in our research, but also coming up in the conversations with companies in the past few years, that even though a company itself may be well aligned and publicly aligned with the Global Plastics Treaty or other regulation, for instance, in the EU with the Packaging and Packaging Waste Regulation, that their industry association may tell a different tale. It's important to make that difference and bring that up in the company engagement. So since the launch in 2023, we have collectively, so it's an investor-led initiative, we have collectively engaged over 30 companies. But more than that, we also sent out more than 100 letters, so investor letters to members of European Parliament to call for an ambitious packaging and packaging waste regulation. But we also sent letters together with the investors to members of the High Ambition Coalition, which is a group of country and country states or country members from the UN that are working on reaching an ambitious and strong global plastics treaty. This is sort of the work that we've done that drove us to Busan at the end of last year. There were opportunities to go earlier, but this being the final round, still speaking back in 2024, that is, it would be nice to conclude the work there. So we were part there. We moderated and participated in several sessions, specifically on what is called Finance Day, a few days before the actual negotiations. As a investor association from the Netherlands, we have no part to play in the negotiations, but around it, mobilizing investors and other stakeholders has been a key part of the work that we've done. And luckily, we're not the only ones. We launched that statement, but straight after that, we had work from others. Planet Tracker did work on the chemical sector. We have the UNEP-FI finance statement that was released last year, together with CDP and the Finance for Biodiversity Foundation and the Business Coalition for the Global Plastics Treaty, and PRI. So that's bringing up and really mobilizing the private finance sector and saying, right, this is a time, a space and time where we can step up the game and be a part and become and play a part in upcoming regulation before it's already set in stone and we're dealing with whatever we're being dealt with, basically. I just want to say a few things about the treaty. I know that's already been mentioned, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, so I'll keep it very brief. In itself, is a multilateral environment, pretty much like the Paris Agreement, the Global Biodiversity Framework, the Basel Convention on the Global Chemical Framework. So that's a very clear, set in stone approach. It's been quite clear from the get-go that this needs to be an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, and it needs to include also the marine environment. And also from the start, and that's also what broke it apart or sort of halted it in Busan, South Korea, there is difficulties in this process, of course, with, let's say, the like-minded countries, the oil-producing countries, where plastic, of course, is their main product, other than, especially since we're also in energy transition and shifting away from fossil fuels. So Busan, South Korea, they hosted the fifth and final round of negotiations. Unfortunately, as both expected and now, of course, very clear, it was not to be. There could not be a consensus reached, which is still part of the process. There needs to be a consensus-based, defined, basically, state. So earlier this week, as Lionel already mentioned, it was confirmed that INC 5.2, which it is now called, it will be hosted in Geneva in August. So this brings up, I think, a final time, and there will be more sessions, I reckon, in the coming weeks and months where we can get all stakeholders involved to mobilize once again for a final and strong round in Switzerland. I want to highlight why it is important for the private finance sector, private sector in general, but zooming in on the finance sector and round off with a few recommendations. So I think we all note, and this is something that we'll see in other multilateral spaces as well, the discourse is shifting from strong and ambitious public policies and funding, emphasizing the word funding here. And I think more and more eyes are sort of peering towards the private sector, the private finance sector, looking at them to come to the aid, basically. We see this development in the other agreements with the Global Biodiversity Framework, of course. And this is where also in the Global Plastics Treaty, the role of the private financial sector comes in. But this is also an opportune time to say it needs to come with clear minimum safeguards as well as guarantees. We can't deal longer, and it's difficult to have uncertainties, and there needs to be very clear de-risking systemic solutions. So it's a few things within the treaty where finance plays a role. Of course, there is being called upon mandatory disclosure. It's important that there is clear and urgent need for improved reporting standards, the data disclosure by companies, and the access that we as a sector and investors individually have to that information. It's important to make informed and impactful decisions. It's absolutely vital that there is an absolute reduction target. So there needs to be phasing out of virgin plastics. And it's important to switch towards reuse and refill models and efforts. There is a talk about in the treaty about certain financing mechanisms that are linked towards plastic credits and EPR, extended producer responsibility. Some of these are tricky. They are not necessarily the solution in itself. And I think that this is as a caution to be well prepared and provide yourself with the knowledge and data to have a good understanding of what they entail when engaging a company or when engaging also public policy makers, for instance. I think the treaty provides the opportunity to lay out a very clear, ambitious, and level playing field for all economies, which is the idea, of course, of such a multilateral environment. We need that level of certainty, but it also needs to enable pathways to reduce, reuse, refill, rather than simply focusing on recycling and other business as usual scenarios. So I'll round off with just a few, let's say, sort of recommendations and also key takeaways in the past few years. I would say as a call to action, become part of the treaty process of the Global Plastics Treaty. You can join initiatives, like I mentioned before, the Business Coalition for a Global Plastics Treaty. There are other financial institutions that have already are endorsing that. I think it's a great way of be informed about it, to be part of it, and in addition also to engage for yourself when it comes a little bit further to national plans, for instance, engage policymakers on the need for strong implementation of that regulation. It's also important to continue or to set up engagement with companies, and it's important that we have a harmonized and unified approach here. And this is, of course, difficult when we are overloaded with information. So this is something that I'll emphasize a little bit later. But when speaking to portfolio companies, I think it's important to make clear that they must phase out virgin plastics and list and phase out hazardous chemicals. The corporate lobbying that should be and must be fully aligned with an ambitious treaty and other regulation. Mandatory disclosure is essential. Think about, for instance, CDP Plastics questionnaire or also the plastic footprint as an analysis. Human health, as difficult as it is as a topic, it needs to be part of that conversation. It's something that came up in many of our calls and meetings, but it's always been dealt with as a difficult subject. And it's important that companies are scaling up reuse and refill models. That's safe to say. As investors, don't go into isolation, don't work at this alone, seek the expertise, engage with NGOs like Ofi has done with Surfrider, work with scientists and civil society groups to ensure a fact-based approach. And I think that the Science Coalition for an Effective Global Plastics Treaty is a great resource for this. Two final ones, be critical of false solutions. Many of the so-called solutions, and I'm going to highlight a few that I know are a bit tricky, but plastic credits, chemical recycling, and specifically weak EPR schemes, those are difficult and you need to be well informed about those before you can commit to those. And that's for both companies as an investor is in a controlling factor. And finally, it's important to look critically at provided ESG data. So the way rating agencies and data providers assess plastic-related risks, it's quite thorough, it's in depth, but it needs also scrutiny. So if their methodologies fail to account for key impacts and key risks, that is something that limits us in making the decisions. So that's really important to keep in mind and also engage them together with all the other stakeholders that need engagement. I think that's it. And thank you very much. If you have any questions later on, happy to answer, of course.
Thank you. Yes, of course. I must remind the audience that you can send us questions or comment by using the chat that you find below the player. We are already receiving some questions, but now I will go back to Raphaëlle for the last question of the roundtable, and then we open the Q&A with the audience. So, Freek, I've mentioned the false solutions to be aware of. And indeed, you as at Surfrider Foundation has highlighted the fact that recycling is a false solution, false good idea, false solution also. So can you explain us why exactly?
Yes, indeed, recycling is often presented as the ultimate solution. Well, it's not. First, let's be clear, I will only talk here about plastic recycling. Recycling works pretty well for other materials such as glass, metal, and paper that can be recycled multiple times, but plastic recycling is extremely limited. And why plastic recycling doesn't work? Mainly for three reasons. The first one is that we produce too much plastic to recycle. Lionel mentioned this figure, but in the world, only 10% of the plastic is actually recycled. And in the European Union, it's 31% that is recycled. The rest is either landfilled, incinerated, or ends up in nature and in the ocean. And us, the Western country in the European Union and the US, export plastic waste to other countries, creating environmental and ethical issues. For a long time, it had been China that received the waste from the European Union. Second reason why recycling plastic doesn't work is that it's not profitable. Virgin plastic is cheaper than recycled plastic. And it could be a nonsense, but the recycling process is costly and results in low quality material. Meaning if you want to have an item in recycled plastic, you have to inject some virgin plastic for it to be, solid enough. And the last reason why it's not working, it's because there are too many different types of plastic. Only PET, the bottles, and HDPE are easily recyclable. Other plastics are sometimes difficult, expensive, or impossible to recycle. In France, it is only in 2023, so 2 years ago, that we had an expansion of the sorting guidelines, accepting new type of plastic other than PET and HDPE to recycle. So French are really bad in terms of recycling in the European Union, contrary to some other country. And from what I saw, Italy has the highest plastic recycling rate in Europe. But still, it doesn't make up for the fact that we produce too much plastic that we can recycle, even more in a globalized world. So recycling is really a false solution. So what should we do instead? So you understood, we must reduce the plastic at the source and deplastify the economy. On this point, the European Commission provides a hierarchy of circularity strategy. I'm sure you heard about this, but in this hierarchy and strategy, the European Commission put the first one in refusing single-use plastic. Then you have reducing, reusing, repairing, and at the 9th and last place, you have recycling. So recycling has to be at the last resort. So to talk about the work of Surfrider Foundation Europe, so we try to influence every kind of stakeholder. First one, we want to raise awareness among the citizens for them to reject overpackaged products in their daily life or at work. Secondly, we do advocacy work on the biggest polluters at the European level. Surfrider is part of a coalition named Break Free from Plastic. Maybe you heard about that. This coalition, each year, they do a brand audit report listing the 10 biggest polluters in the world. So you have a list, and they put pressure on them to take responsibility for their plastic waste. So in this list, you have Coca-Cola, for instance, PepsiCo, Procter & Gamble, Unilever, Nestlé, each year part of this top 10 list. In January of 2023, Surfrider, with 2 other NGOs, filed a lawsuit in France against Danone, arguing that the company was failing to address its plastic pollution under France's duty of vigilance law. I don't have the time to talk to you about the result of this mediation, but I can answer that in the question if you're interested. And last but not least, we focus on raising awareness across all sectors, including the finance sector. So what is the role of finance in plastic reduction? And I will join the conclusion of Freek on this. In Surfrider's experience, we saw that many financial actors lack understanding the true definition of circular economy, which is not about just recycling, but really about keeping products and material in use as long as possible. So for instance, and Lionel mentioned that we did a huge work with Ofi on this regard, but with other financial actors, we also work to create more ambitious exclusion policies in investment portfolio, focusing on deplastification. And Freek mentioned that on the phasing out, but this could be really a solution on this. So as a conclusion, to truly tackle plastic pollution, we must shift investment priority from single-use to reusable solution, from recycling to reduction, and from corporate responsibility to corporate accountability. So the financial sector has a crucial role to play in making this transition happen. Thank you for listening to me, and I'm open to the question if you have some.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So yes, indeed, we can open the Q&A session. So I see the other speakers showing at the screen. So we have received a couple of questions. I remind again the audience that you can send us your comments and questions by using the chat just below the player. I will read these 2 questions we have received for the moment. So the first one, so I will read as we have received it. Which aspects or key KPIs do investors take into consideration, maybe also should take into consideration in the evaluation of companies' transition plans regarding plastic pollution? Maybe could be also be, as I mentioned, a recommendation, some suggestion to investors. And the second one is regarding data on companies' impacts on plastic pollutions, and the comments also on the recently released EU Commission proposal on the omnibus package, and maybe also if you are taking position on this. So this is the second question. Please answer as you wish to one of those.
Okay. Freek, do you want to go first? Yeah.
Yeah, I can. Freek, go ahead.
I'll give a quick on the first one, and maybe Lionel, I think you may want to add on it, but that's up to you. So which of the aspects, KPIs, do investors take into consideration? So one of the key things that in the engagements that we looked at was how are they performing in the global commitment of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. So there was a very clear reduction target there, the 100%. And that is something that we assessed The second thing that we looked at was the reduction of virgin plastic. So usually you'll find that companies had set very clear targets out in terms of reducing virgin plastic and making the shift to more recycled content or reuse and refill. I think with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and the global commitment that was there for 5 years, is now looking at the next phase, and we already noted in many of the conversations, but also in the reporting, that companies were shifting in 2023 and 2024 already their horizon or their timing towards 2030. So that is something to consider when engaging them as well for the longer term. What's going on in the world, basically, of setting those targets as a very, as a brief point.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Regarding the data point, I don't know if Raphaëlle or maybe we can then have the closing remarks. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to add to Freek answer. Really, the most important numbers, this is the volume of plastic they are buying, So if you can see a downturn, this is something good. But as I mentioned, a lot of companies, they cannot decorrelate their sales number growth with the growth of plastic. And also, I will say, if they invest into solutions, because we need to have budget in R&D and CapEx ramp up, and this is also something that we look at carefully for KPIs. And regarding the question regarding data on companies and what's going on with the omnibus package, I cannot answer yet precisely, but what I can tell you is that first, with the plastic global talk, we are still speaking about setting a target. So we are not in the process of revising down our ambition. We are in the process of having reduction numbers. And also, you have to keep in mind that even if some countries display a kind of backlash against, they are fighting against wokeism, you have, as I did show you with the global map, you have still regional bans, so you still have a minority, but close to 50% in some countries that are willing to go towards a plastic ban, and you see that through regional bans, for instance. And I think this is just what I can say to you about the omnibus package so far. So we need to keep to have strong ambitions, and we need to keep the right direction.
Thank you. Perfect.
Well,
Raphaëlle, if you want to add something, please.
I can complete as NGO, environmental NGO point of view on the omnibus package. For us, this is really scary it's happening, because if I understood well, the aim of this is to cut off the double materiality principle out of the European Green Deal. I'm sure you all know what it is, but the definition is that it requires companies to report both the impact of environmental and social issues on their financial performance and on their own impact on the environment and society. So it's the tool, basically, that makes it possible to make companies more accountable, to ensure an effective duty of vigilance, and to implement appropriate carbon taxes. So the fact that this could be threatened to be out of the European Green Deal is really not a good sign for the environmental NGO in their work of influencing the companies towards best practices. And what I heard and read about it is that on the agenda is planned a reduction in the numbers of companies covered by those reporting obligations, suspension of the duty of care, elimination of responsibility beyond direct suppliers, and of course the elimination of this principle of double materiality. So we will follow this really closely at Surfrider Foundation Europe, but a bit scary for us.
Thank you. Yes, for the instance, in the EU Commission proposal, double materiality is still there. Of course, it's just a proposal. It must be discussed in the trilogue, so with the EU Parliament and EU Council. We are also following very carefully these developments. We have received other questions. Now it's time for Lionel closing remarks, but I will read out the questions. So maybe Lionel, if you want to answer to some of them during your closing remarks, that would be great. And in any case, it's interesting maybe to know what the audience is interested about. It's interesting in. So one question is regarding the impact of the let's say ESG backlash in plastic related issues. So there seems to be less engagement on the issue of net zero with banks and asset managers leading net zero alliances. And so the question is that if you have noticed a similar trend also in plastic pollution, but maybe you have also already answered a little bit to this question in your previous comment, Lionel, but if you want to add something, more than welcome. Then a question asking what Italian investors could concretely ask companies in oil and gas industry as well as in the packaging industry about de-risking plastic. So a recommendation, suggestion regarding precise questions that could be asked. And if you suggest to disinvest or not invest, so exclude companies that do not collaborate in the engagement in a satisfying way. So please, Lionel, I give you the floor for closing remarks.
Yes. So
and thank you, Raphaëlle and Freek, of course, for your.
So it's a lot of many questions left. But for instance, in our engagement, one company did not answer at all. That was the biggest retailer in the US. But this is not one reason why we have excluded them, okay? But everybody guessed their name. Also, regarding the question regarding the oil industry, it's very tricky because the oil industry, as Freek mentioned, they are losing the market of the fossil fuels. So they are sticking to the plastic market a lot. So for them, it will be difficult to admit that they will have to reduce production there. And also, when we engage with them, we engage them more on climate than on plastic. So it's difficult to find time to engage on plastic with them. Also, to conclude, I hope our presentation on the panel discussion has shown to you the urgency of tackling the plastic crisis, and that it will lead you to change your consumer habits. Probably you will need to buy a bigger plastic of bottle rather than smaller plastic of bottles, or you will go to find other solution of consuming. And also, we need you to act along us to prevent the advent of the 6th mass extinction event. And NGOs such as Surfrider has been able to have a win recently on the duty of care with Danone. So this is good for the engagement. And also we need more companies to start to embrace deplastification trajectories to protect our blue planet and the wonderful Earth. And Ofi is part of the social economy movement. So for us, this is something that is important. The health of the planet is probably more important sometimes than financial result as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Lionel. Thank you very much to all the speakers. We can close this webinar. I thank you, of course, all the people that followed us during this hour. All the material, the slide, as well as the video recording will be available on our website in the upcoming days. I wish you a wonderful day and see you next time. The next webinar is scheduled for the 14th of April. Thank you and have a nice day.